I watched my father slide a $4 million check across the table to my sister like it was nothing, like it didn't just redraw the entire map of our family in one quiet motion. And for a second all I could see was the reflection of that number in the polished wood, warped and distant, like it was never meant to belong to me in the first place. Sophia has always known how to turn opportunity into results, he said, his voice carrying just enough pride to fill the room. And then without even looking at me he added, Emily, well, she's just not built for that kind of success. And the room responded exactly the way they always did, a few polite laughs, a few knowing glances, the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all but agreement dressed up as manners. There were 30 people in that room, maybe more, extended family, business partners, people who had watched me grow up and somehow still managed to see right through me. And I stood there holding a glass of water I hadn't touched, feeling the weight of every label they'd ever given me settle into place again like it had been waiting for this exact moment. This wasn't new, not really, just louder, more expensive, more public, because when I was 16 Sophia got a brand new BMW with a red ribbon on top while I got a reminder to focus on something practical. And when we both got into college, my parents called hers an investment and mine a risk. And when I tried to explain my plans, my ideas, the things I was building quietly on my own, my father would just nod like he was humoring a child who didn't understand how the world worked. I learned early that arguing didn't change anything. It only gave them more proof that I didn't belong in their version of success, so I stopped explaining, I stopped defending, and I started watching instead, listening, paying attention to the details they thought I'd never notice, the way money moved, the way decisions were made, the way power was never loud until it needed to be. Across the table Sophia smiled the way she always did, perfect, controlled, grateful in exactly the right way, and for a moment she met my eyes just long enough for me to see something behind it, something sharp and calculating, like she already knew this story had been written long before tonight and she had simply stepped into the role designed for her. You should be happy for your sister, my mother said softly beside me, her tone rehearsed, gentle but firm, the same voice she used every time she needed me to accept something without question. And I nodded because that was easier, because it always had been, because pushing back in this family didn't create space, it erased you. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had my own path, my own plans, that the way they saw me wasn't the whole truth, but standing there, hearing my father reduce me to a single word in front of everyone who mattered to him, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. This wasn't just about money, it never had been, it was about value, about who was worth believing in and who wasn't, about who got handed the future and who was expected to quietly step aside. I set my glass down without making a sound, the condensation leaving a faint ring on the table, temporary, already fading, and I remember thinking how fitting that was, how easy it was for something to exist and disappear in the same moment without anyone really noticing. Excuse me, I said, barely above a whisper, and no one stopped me, no one asked where I was going because to them I was already gone. Just background noise in a room that had never been built for me. But what they didn't see, what none of them noticed as I walked past the doorway, was the man standing just beyond the frame, adjusting his cufflinks, watching everything with a calm, unreadable expression, waiting. And I didn't realize then how important that moment was, how everything that had just happened was only the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. I stepped out into the hallway and the noise from the dining room dulled instantly, like someone had closed a door on an entire version of my life that I had been trying to outgrow for years. And for a moment I just stood there staring at the marble floor, replaying my father's words in my head, not because they were new, but because of how easily they still landed exactly where they were meant to. I should have been used to it by now, the labels, the comparisons, the quiet way they rewrote my identity in front of other people. But something about tonight felt different, heavier, like a line had been crossed that could not be undone. And I realized I was not even angry in the way I expected to be, just clear, almost calm, like a part of me had finally stopped waiting for them to see me differently. Behind me, I could still hear fragments of conversation, my mother's voice explaining Sophia's vision, my father discussing returns and strategy, the language of value that had always excluded me, and I remembered being 17, sitting at this same house, listening to him explain why funding Sophia's business internship made sense while mine would be a waste of capital. And I had nodded back then too, pretending I understood, pretending I agreed, because it was easier than admitting how much it mattered. I moved further down the hallway, past framed photographs of milestones that never quite included me the same way, birthdays where I stood slightly off-center, graduations where the focus was always on someone else, and I used to think if I worked harder, if I proved myself quietly, Eventually they would notice, eventually something would shift, but tonight made it clear that nothing was going to shift on its own, not for me. "Miss Carter," a voice said behind me, steady, measured, and I turned to see the man I had barely registered earlier, tall, composed, mid-50s maybe, wearing a dark suit that fit too precisely to be anything but intentional, and there was something about the way he looked at me that immediately felt different, not sympathetic, not dismissive, just aware. "I believe we have not been formally introduced," he continued, offering a small nod. "Harrison Cole," and the name landed with a weight I recognized even if I could not immediately place it, because I had heard it before, not in conversation but in documents, in quiet mentions that were never explained to me directly. I hesitated for a second, then shook his hand, his grip firm but not overpowering, and for a moment neither of us said anything, like he was giving me space to decide whether I wanted to engage or walk away, something no one in my family had ever really done. "You handled that well," he said finally, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was the first time anyone had described my silence as anything other than weakness. "I did not handle anything," I replied, my voice steady. "I just did what I always do." And he studied me for a second longer than felt comfortable, like he was measuring something I could not see. "That depends," he said quietly, "on what you think this moment actually was." And there was a pause, just long enough for the meaning behind his words to settle in. Because he was not talking about dinner, not really, he was talking about something larger, something already in motion. I glanced back toward the dining room, the light spilling out into the hallway, the sound of laughter rising again as if nothing significant had happened, as if the night had gone exactly the way it was supposed to, and for the first time I felt completely separate from it, like I was no longer part of that system, just someone who had been standing inside it a little too long. "I should go," I said, more to myself than to him because staying suddenly felt impossible, and he nodded once, not stopping me, not questioning it, just stepping slightly aside to give me a clear path forward. As I walked toward the front door, I could feel his gaze follow me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me aware that whatever he knew, whatever he was waiting for, it involved me in a way I did not yet understand, and I reached for the handle, pausing for a fraction of a second as a strange thought crossed my mind. Not fear, not doubt, just a quiet realization that tonight was not ending the way I had expected it to. It was opening something else entirely, something that had been building long before I ever stepped into that dining room, and I did not realize then how close I already was to finding out the truth. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the night air, the sound of laughter and glassware fading behind me as the heavy door closed, and for a moment I just stood on the stone steps, breathing in slowly, letting the silence settle in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, like I had finally stepped out of a role I had been playing for far too long without realizing it. The driveway was lined with cars, polished, expensive, each one a quiet reminder of the world my family understood and respected, a world built on numbers and appearances and carefully measured outcomes, and I had spent years trying to prove I belonged in it, trying to translate myself into something they would recognize. But tonight made it clear that I had been speaking a language they never intended to hear. I walked down the steps and onto the gravel path, the soft crunch under my shoes grounding me, and as I reached the edge of the property, I heard the door open again behind me, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You are leaving early," Harrison Cole said, his tone even, almost observational, as if he was noting a detail rather than questioning it. And I let out a quiet breath before responding. "There is nothing for me in there." And for the first time saying it out loud did not feel like defeat, it felt accurate. He stepped beside me, not too close, not intrusive, just present, and for a few seconds we both looked out toward the street, the soft glow of streetlights stretching into the distance, the kind of quiet that usually comes after something has already shifted. "Your grandmother would disagree," he said, and that made me turn because he had said it so simply, like it was an obvious fact, like it did not require explanation, and my chest tightened slightly at the mention of her, not with pain exactly, but with something heavier, something unresolved. "You knew her," I said, and it was not really a question, more a confirmation of something that was already beginning to make sense, because of course he did, of course she would have trusted someone like him, someone who moved the way he did, carefully, intentionally. He nodded once, his expression unchanged, for a long time, and there was a pause, the kind that holds more than what is being said, and I felt a flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel in years, Not quite hope, not yet, but curiosity, sharp and immediate. Then you also know she would not have wanted this, I said, gesturing vaguely back toward the house, the money, the conversation, the quiet dismissal of everything I was, and he studied me for a moment before replying. She knew exactly what would happen. And the way he said it made something in me shift. Because there was no judgment in his voice, no sympathy either, just certainty. I frowned slightly, trying to process that, because if she had known, if she had seen all of this coming, then the question was not why it happened, but what she had done about it, and before I could ask, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim, dark envelope, sealed, unmarked except for a single detail that immediately caught my attention, my name, written in a handwriting I recognized. Instantly, my breath caught for just a second, not dramatically, just enough to make everything else go quiet, because I had not seen that handwriting in years, not since the last time I sat with her at her kitchen table while she explained something to me in a way no one else ever had, patient, precise, like she believed I would understand if I was just given the chance. She asked me to give you this when the time was right, he said, holding it out to me, not forcing it, just offering it. And I hesitated, not because I did not want to take it, but because I suddenly understood that whatever was inside that envelope was not small, it was not casual, it was something she had planned, something she had protected, something she had waited to reveal until this exact moment. I reached out and took it, the paper cool against my fingers, heavier than it should have been for its size, and for a second I just looked at it, tracing the curve of the letters in my name, feeling the weight of everything I had just walked away from and everything I might be stepping into. Why now? I asked quietly, my voice steadier than I expected, and Harrison Cole's answer came without hesitation. Because tonight you finally stopped asking them to see you. And the words landed with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore what they meant, because he was right, something had changed, not in them but in me, and as I stood there holding that envelope, I realized that whatever came next was not going to be about proving anything to my family anymore. It was going to be about something else entirely, something she had set in motion long before any of us understood what was really at stake. And I did not realize then just how much that envelope was about to change everything. I did not open the envelope right away. Not because I was not curious, but because something about the moment felt too precise to rush, like tearing it open too quickly would somehow reduce the weight of whatever my grandmother had intended for me to understand. So instead I held it in both hands and looked down at my name again, tracing the ink with my eyes, remembering how she used to write grocery lists, recipes, little notes she would leave for me on the kitchen counter when I stayed with her during summers, always neat, always deliberate, as if every word mattered. You can read it now, Harrison Cole said quietly, but there was no pressure in his voice, just an acknowledgement that the decision was mine, and I let out a slow breath before sliding my finger under the sealed edge and opening it carefully, making sure not to tear the paper, not to rush the moment. Inside was a single folded sheet, thicker than standard paper, the kind used for formal documents, and as I unfolded it, the first thing I saw was not the text itself, but her signature at the bottom, Eleanor Carter, written in that same steady hand. And something in my chest tightened, not with sadness exactly, but with recognition, like she was still speaking to me through it. I forced myself to look at the beginning, to actually read, and the first line was simple, direct, exactly the way she always spoke to me. Emily, if you are reading this, then you have already seen what I knew you would see. And I paused just for a second because that line alone told me everything about her mindset. She had not hoped things would change, she had expected them not to. I continued, my eyes moving slower now, absorbing each word. Your father values outcomes he can measure, your mother values appearances she can control, and Sophia has learned to operate within both systems. But you, Emily, you have always seen what they overlook. And I felt my grip on the paper tighten slightly because she was not just describing them, she was describing me in a way no one else ever had, not as lacking, not as less, but as different. Intentionally so. I swallowed and kept reading. For years I watched them misunderstand you, and for years I chose not to interfere, not because I agreed, but because I needed you to become something they could never shape. And that stopped me completely because it reframed everything I had experienced, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, not as random, but as something she had seen and allowed for a reason I was only beginning to understand. The next line was shorter, sharper. You were never the failure they believed you to be. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting that settle in a place that had been empty for a long time, because hearing it, even like this, even on paper, felt different than telling it to myself. When I opened my eyes again, I moved to the final section, the part that had been folded more tightly, as if it carried more weight, and the tone shifted slightly, still calm, but more direct, more intentional. I have taken steps to ensure that what belongs to you cannot be dismissed, ignored, or reassigned. And my pulse picked up just enough for me to notice, not panic, just awareness, because now this was no longer just about validation, it was about action. I read the final lines carefully. You will not need to argue with them, Emily, you will not need to convince anyone of your value, because when the time comes, the structure will speak for itself, and they will have no choice but to listen. And for a moment I just stood there, the paper still in my hands, the night air quiet around me, the house behind me filled with people who believed they had already decided everything that mattered. And I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to consider before. This was not a message of comfort, it was a message of preparation. Something had already been set in motion, something structured, deliberate, something that did not depend on their approval or their understanding. There is more, Harrison Cole said, his voice breaking the silence just enough to bring me back, and I looked up at him, the paper still open in my hands, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces I had not even known existed, and the way he looked at me told me that whatever came next was not optional, it was inevitable. And I did not realize then just how close I was to seeing the part of this story my family had never prepared for. I folded the letter slowly, not because I was done reading it, but because I understood that whatever came next was no longer about words on paper. It was about something already built, something my grandmother had put into place long before tonight. And I looked up at Harrison Cole, my voice quieter now but more focused. What structure? I asked, and he did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because he was choosing how much to reveal and when, the same way my grandmother always had. Your grandmother did not believe in leaving things to chance, he said finally, his tone steady. She believed in systems that could not be ignored. And there was something about the way he said it that made my pulse shift again, not fear, not exactly, but anticipation, the kind that comes when something you never expected starts to make sense piece by piece. He reached into his briefcase this time, not rushed, not dramatic, and pulled out a thin folder, dark blue, the kind used in formal meetings, the kind I had seen my father carry into rooms where decisions were made without me, and he held it for a second before handing it to me, the same way he had handed me the envelope, offering, not forcing. This is a summary, he said, and that word alone told me how much more there must be behind it, because if this was only a summary, then whatever my grandmother had created was far larger than I had imagined. I took the folder and opened it carefully, my eyes moving across the first page, and the language was different from the letter, more structured, more precise, legal terms layered with financial language, but underneath it I could still feel her intention, her clarity, the same way she used to explain things to me in the kitchen, breaking down complex ideas into something I could actually see. The first line that stood out was a title, clear and unmistakable, Carter Family Trust, and my breath paused just slightly because I had heard that name before, always in passing, always in conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and I kept reading slower now, making sure I did not miss anything because every word felt placed exactly where it needed to be. Percentages, control clauses, beneficiary structures, and then one line that made everything else fall into place in a way I was not prepared for, primary controlling beneficiary, Emily Carter, and I stared at it, not because I did not understand the words, but because I understood them too well, because I knew exactly what that meant in my father's world, in the language he respected, the only language he ever truly listened to. I looked up at Harrison, my expression still calm but something deeper shifting underneath. They gave Sophia $4 million, I said, not as a complaint, not as a question, just as a statement of fact, and he nodded slightly. Yes. And there was a brief silence before I continued. And they think that settles everything. And this time the corner of his expression changed just enough to register, not quite a smile but recognition. That is because they do not know what this is, he said, and his gaze dropped briefly to the document in my hands, and more importantly, they do not know what it gives you. And I felt the weight of the folder shift slightly in my grip, not physically but in meaning, because this was no longer abstract. It was not just a letter, not just reassurance, it was authority, structured, documented, impossible to dismiss in the same way they had dismissed me. I looked back down at the page, reading further, seeing the clauses that outline decision rights, control over distributions, oversight over assets I had never even been told existed, and a strange clarity settled over me, the kind that does not come from emotion, but from understanding, because for the first time, I could see the system they had always operated within, And I could see where I fit into it now, not at the edge, not outside, but at the center in a way they had never anticipated. When does this take effect? I asked, my voice steady, and Harrison's response came without hesitation. It already has. And that was the moment. Something inside me fully shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely, because everything that had happened tonight, the check, the words, the laughter, all of it had been built on an assumption that no longer held. And I closed the folder slowly, my mind already moving ahead, already understanding what this meant, not just for me but for them, because when they realized what had been put in place without their knowledge, without their control, it would not be a conversation they could manage or redirect. I glanced back once more at the house, the lights still bright, the voices still rising, completely unaware of what was about to change, and I did not realize then how quickly that change was going to reach them. I did not go back inside that night, not because I was avoiding them, but because I already understood something they did not. The conversation they thought they had finished was only beginning, just not on their terms anymore. And as I stood there with the folder in my hands, I felt a kind of clarity I had never experienced before, not emotional, not reactive, just precise, like every piece of the puzzle had finally aligned into something I could actually use. What happens when they find out? I asked, my eyes still on the house, the lights, the movement behind the windows, and Harrison Cole adjusted his stance slightly before answering. That depends on when you decide they should. And that answer stayed with me longer than I expected because it shifted the control completely. It was not about timing dictated by events or by them, it was about choice mine. I thought about that for a moment. About all the years where I had been reacting, adjusting, trying to fit into expectations that were never designed for me. And now suddenly, I was the one holding the timeline, the one deciding when something became real to everyone else, and that realization settled into me quietly but firmly. They are celebrating in there, I said, more to myself than to him. They think they made the final decision tonight, and Harrison gave a small nod. Yes, they do. And there was something almost understated in the way he said it, like he had seen this kind of situation before, like he already knew exactly how it would unfold once the truth surfaced. I glanced back at the document again, the lines of authority, the clauses that did not require approval, the structure that did not depend on belief, and I remembered all the times my father had said that control was everything, that whoever controlled the structure controlled the outcome, and for the first time, I realized that he had been right, just not in the way he intended. If I walk back in there right now, I said slowly, and tell them what this says, they will not believe me. And Harrison did not hesitate. No, they will not. And that did not surprise me because disbelief had always been their first response to anything that did not fit their expectations, and I could already imagine the way my father would dismiss it, the way my mother would try to smooth it over, the way Sophia would watch, calculating, adjusting. I closed the folder and held it at my side, the weight of it no longer uncertain but defined, and I realized that this was not about proving anything in a moment, not about standing in that dining room and trying to reverse the narrative in front of 30 people who had already decided who I was. This was about something else, something quieter but far more decisive, something that would not require their agreement to take effect. Then we do it properly, I said, my voice steady, and Harrison looked at me for a second, not surprised, just confirming. A formal notice, he replied, documentation, execution, and then they will not have a choice. And there it was again, that word choice, except this time it applied to them, or more accurately, the absence of it. I let out a slow breath and nodded once because this made sense in a way nothing else ever had. This was the language they understood, the only language they respected, not emotion, not explanation, but structure, authority, undeniable terms laid out in a way that could not be argued away. I took one last look at the house, the place that had defined me for so long, the place where I had been measured and found lacking again and again. And for the first time I did not feel small standing outside of it. I felt separate, like I was no longer part of the system it represented, and that separation did not feel like loss, it felt like distance, necessary, intentional. Tomorrow morning, Harrison said, as if reading the direction my thoughts were already moving, we begin. And I nodded again because there was no hesitation left, no second guessing, just a clear next step, and as I turned away from the house and started toward the street, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Tonight was not the moment everything changed, it was the moment everything revealed itself, and what came next was not going to be loud or immediate, but it was going to be irreversible, and they were not ready for that. The next morning did not feel dramatic. There was no sense of urgency, no rush, just a quiet, deliberate shift in everything I did. Like I was stepping into a role that had been waiting for me long before I understood it existed. and as I sat across from Harrison Cole in his office, the city moving steadily outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized how different this environment felt compared to my family's house. There was no need to prove anything here. No unspoken hierarchy pressing down on every word, just clarity, structure, and intention. The office itself was precise, dark wood, clean lines, documents arranged with a level of order that felt almost intentional, like nothing in this space existed without purpose, and in a way that made it easier to focus because for once I was not reacting, I was preparing. Harrison slid a set of documents across the table toward me, each page marked with tabs, annotations, details that broke down the structure I had only briefly seen the night before, and I leaned forward slightly, scanning the headings: distribution control, asset oversight, executive authority, terms that I had heard my father use for years, except now they were aligned in a way that pointed directly to me. Before we proceed, Harrison said, his tone steady as always, you need to understand exactly what this gives you, and what it does not. And I nodded because that mattered, not just the power itself but the limits of it, the boundaries that defined how it could be used, because this was not about emotion, it was about precision. He began outlining it step by step: the trust structure my grandmother had built, the assets tied to it, properties, investments, holdings that extended far beyond anything I had ever been told existed, and more importantly, the control clauses that placed decision-making authority entirely under the primary beneficiary, me. And as he spoke, I did not feel overwhelmed, I felt focused, because for the first time the complexity of something did not exclude me. It aligned with the way I had always processed things: patterns, connections, systems that made sense when viewed as a whole. Your father assumed he was managing everything, Harrison continued, but in reality he was operating within a structure that was never fully his. And that statement settled into place immediately, because it explained something I had never questioned before. The confidence my father carried, the certainty in his decisions, all built on an assumption that had never actually been tested. I looked down at the document again, my eyes moving across the clauses that outlined execution procedures, formal notices, legal obligations that would activate once the trust was formally asserted, and I asked the one question that mattered most: when we file this, what changes first? And Harrison did not hesitate. Control of distribution immediately followed by disclosure requirements, and that was when I fully understood the sequence, not just what this would do, but how it would unfold step by step, in a way that could not be stopped once it began. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, because this was no longer abstract, it was actionable, and with action came consequence, not emotional consequence but structural, measurable, undeniable. They will try to push back, I said, not as a concern, just as a fact, and Harrison gave a small nod. They will try, he agreed, but they will not have the authority to stop it. And there it was again, that distinction: effort versus control, reaction versus structure, and I realized that for all the years my family had defined value in terms of outcomes, they had overlooked the one thing that actually determined outcomes in the end: authority over the system itself. I closed the folder slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I was done reviewing what I needed to know for now, and I met Harrison's gaze directly. Then we proceed, I said, my voice even, no hesitation, no second guessing, and he held my gaze for a moment before nodding once, confirming what had already been decided. As I stood up, gathering the documents, I felt something shift again, not externally, nothing visible had changed yet, but internally, completely, because for the first time, I was not waiting for something to happen to me. I was initiating something that would unfold exactly as it was designed to. And as I walked toward the door, I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge until now. This was not about confronting my family. It was about stepping into a position they never imagined I could hold, and once that process began, there would be no version of the story where they remained in control, and they did not know that yet. The first notice was sent at 9:12 a.m., not with drama, not with urgency, just with precision, a formal document delivered through the exact channels my father had trusted for decades, the same channels he believed he controlled, and I was sitting across from Harrison when the confirmation came through, a simple acknowledgement that it had been received, nothing more, nothing less, but that was enough because in his world, acknowledgement meant obligation, and obligation meant the process had already begun. I did not feel anything dramatic in that moment, no rush of victory, no sense of revenge, just a quiet awareness that something irreversible had been set into motion. And I found myself thinking about how many times I had been told I did not understand how things worked, how many times my perspective had been dismissed because it did not match theirs, And now, without raising my voice, without stepping back into that house, I had shifted the structure they relied on. They will read it within the hour, Harrison said, glancing briefly at his watch, and I nodded because timing mattered now, not emotionally but strategically, because once they read it, the assumptions they had built everything on would begin to unravel, not all at once, but in a sequence they could not interrupt. I imagined my father in his office, the same office where he had made decisions that shaped everyone's lives without ever asking for input, opening the document with the same confidence he approached everything else, expecting to confirm control, not realizing he was about to confront the absence of it, and I wondered what his expression would look like in that exact moment. Not anger, not yet, but confusion, the kind that comes when something does not align with the structure you believe you understand. And Sophia, I said, my voice steady, because she was not just part of this, she was positioned within it. What happens to her position? And Harrison's response was immediate. She retains what has already been transferred, but future distributions fall under your authority. And that made sense because this was not about undoing what had already happened, it was about redefining what came next. And I realized that was exactly how my grandmother had designed it, not to create chaos, but to establish control in a way that could not be dismissed as emotional or reactive. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, because it meant that everything moving forward would require acknowledgement, not from me but from them, and that shift was more significant than anything else, because it forced them into a position they had never occupied before, one where they were not the ones defining the outcome. The second notice followed shortly after, more detailed, outlining execution procedures, compliance requirements, and disclosure obligations, each clause structured in a way that left no room for interpretation, no space for dismissal, and as I reviewed it, I could see the pattern clearly, the same pattern I had spent years observing without realizing how it could apply to me. Systems layered on systems, each one reinforcing the next until the entire structure became undeniable. Once they respond, Harrison said, we proceed to full disclosure, and I nodded again because that was the moment everything would become visible, not just to them, but to anyone connected to the trust, partners, advisors, people who operated within the same framework of authority and accountability, and I understood exactly why that mattered because my family's power had always depended on perception as much as reality, and this would shift both at the same time. My phone remained silent for a while longer than I expected, and I knew that silence was not calm, it was processing. It was the moment where they were reading, rereading, trying to find a way to reinterpret what they were seeing, to fit it into a version of reality where they still held control, and I recognized that instinct because I had lived around it my entire life, the need to maintain the narrative, to reshape anything that threatened it. Then, at exactly 10:03 a.m., my phone lit up, my father's name appearing on the screen, and I looked at it for a second before picking it up, not rushing, not hesitating, just deliberate. Because this conversation was no longer about seeking understanding or approval, it was about acknowledging a reality that had already shifted, and as I answered I realized that for the first time I was not stepping into his world, he was stepping into mine, and he did not know how to navigate it. I did not say anything right away when I answered the call, and that silence lasted just long enough for him to fill it. Emily, my father said, his voice controlled but tighter than I had ever heard it, not raised, not emotional, just strained in a way that told me he was already off balance. I just received something from a law firm, and I could almost see him standing in his office, one hand on the desk, the document spread out in front of him, reading it again even as he spoke, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true. Yes, I replied, my tone even, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to justify, just acknowledgement, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion exactly, but recalibration. Like he was adjusting his approach in real time. There must be some mistake, he said next, and there it was, exactly what I expected, not denial in the loud sense, but in the structured, logical tone he always used when something did not align with his expectations. The trust has always been under my management, and I let that sit for a second before answering because this was not about correcting him quickly, it was about letting the reality settle in its own way. It was never fully yours, I said, and my voice did not change, no emphasis, no accusation, just a statement, and the silence that followed this time was longer, heavier, because now he was not just processing information, he was confronting a contradiction he could not easily dismiss. Emily, he said again, slower now, you do not understand how these structures work, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, the same sentence, the same assumption, repeated for years without question. And for the first time it did not land the way it used to. I understand enough, I replied, and the documents are clear. And there was a shift on the line, subtle but unmistakable, because clarity is something he respected, and hearing it from me in that tone, without hesitation, without uncertainty, forced him to adjust again. We will need to review this properly, he said, moving back into process, into structure, the place where he felt most in control. There are procedures, interpretations, and I did not interrupt him. I let him finish because I knew what was coming next, the attempt to reframe, to slow things down, to create space where he could regain footing. The procedures have already been initiated, I said when he paused, and that was the moment everything changed on the call, not dramatically, not loudly, but definitively, because now this was no longer about interpretation, it was about execution. There was a sound on his end, not clear, maybe the shifting of papers, maybe the chair moving slightly, but it was enough to tell me he was not as composed as he sounded, and I realized something in that moment that I had never experienced before. He was not leading this conversation, he was responding to it. Who is advising you? He asked, and that question carried more weight than the others because it revealed what he was really trying to understand, not just the document but the source, the authority behind it, and I glanced briefly at Harrison across the table before answering. The same person who advised Grandma. And that was enough. I could hear it in the silence that followed because that name, that connection, meant something in his world, something that could not be easily dismissed or minimized. This changes things, he said finally, and there was no denial in that sentence, no attempt to correct or override, just acknowledgement, and that was the first real shift, the first moment where he accepted that the situation was not what he thought it was. Yes, I replied again, and this time the word carried a different weight, not agreement, not compliance, but confirmation, and I realized as I said it that this was not a confrontation, it was a transition from one structure to another, from one position to another, and he was the one adjusting to it. We will discuss this further, he added, moving toward closure, toward control again, but it sounded different now, less certain, more measured, and I did not push back, I did not add anything because there was nothing left to establish in this moment. We will, I said, and then the call ended, not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished, and I lowered the phone slowly, looking at it for a second before setting it down on the table, and as I did, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. This was the first conversation we had ever had where he did not define who I was, and he knew it, even if he had not said it out loud, and what he did next would determine how far that shift would go. The room felt quieter after the call ended, not because anything had physically changed, but because the direction of everything had, and I sat there for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the table, letting that shift settle into something real instead of something reactive, because for the first time, I was not waiting to see what they would do next. I already knew the pattern they would follow, and more importantly, I knew where it would lead. He will call a meeting, Harrison said, calmly, as if continuing a conversation we had not paused, and I glanced up at him, not surprised, just confirming. With everyone, I replied, and he nodded once. Yes, and he will try to reframe this as a discussion rather than a transition. And that made sense because control in my father's world had always been tied to narrative, to how a situation was presented, not just what it actually was. I leaned back slightly in my chair, thinking through the sequence, because now it was not about reacting to them, it was about anticipating them, and I could already see how it would unfold, the urgency masked as organization, the tone measured but firm, the attempt to bring everything back into a structure he believed he could manage. He will want me there, I said, and Harrison's response was immediate. He will need you there. And that distinction mattered because needing implied dependency, and dependency shifted the balance in a way my father was not used to navigating. I glanced down at the documents again, the language clear, the authority defined, and I remembered all the times I had been told to stay quiet in conversations like that, to listen, to observe, to let others lead, and I realized how different this one would be, not because I planned to argue, but because I did not need to. When it happens, I said slowly, I am not explaining anything, and Harrison gave a small nod. You do not have to, he replied. The structure will speak for itself, and hearing that again reinforced something I was only just beginning to fully understand. This was not about persuasion. It was about presentation, not emotional, not reactive, just factual in a way that could not be dismissed. My phone remained still for a while after that, no new calls, no messages, and that silence felt intentional, not absence but preparation on their side, because I knew my father well enough to know he would not respond impulsively. He would gather information, consult advisors, try to identify a path that restored his position, and I respected that, not personally but structurally, because it meant the next move would be calculated, not emotional. He will look for weaknesses, I said, almost thinking out loud, and Harrison nodded again. That is what he does, he agreed. But this was designed to withstand that, and there was something reassuring in that statement, not comforting but solid, because it reminded me that this was not something I had built alone. It was something my grandmother had constructed with intention, anticipating exactly this kind of response. I stood up slowly, gathering the documents, and walked toward the window, looking out at the city below, people moving through their day without any awareness of the shift that had just begun in my life. And for a moment, I thought about how many times I had felt out of place in rooms like my family's dining room, how many times I had been positioned as an observer rather than a participant, and I realized that position had never actually been about my capability, it had been about their perception, something that no longer held the same weight. When he calls, I said, turning slightly back toward Harrison, we set the terms, and he met my gaze with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. Yes, he replied, you do. And that simple exchange carried more meaning than anything else, because it confirmed what I was already starting to accept. This was no longer about finding a place within their system. It was about defining one that they would have to operate within. I picked up my phone again, glancing at the screen, knowing it was only a matter of time before it lit up once more. Not with confusion this time, but with intention, and as I set it back down, I felt that same clarity returned, steady, controlled, because whatever happened next, whatever meeting was called, whatever words were said, the outcome had already been shaped not by emotion, not by perception, but by structure, and they were about to step into it whether they were ready or not. The call came just after noon, not rushed, not uncertain, but controlled in the way my father always approached situations he believed he could still manage, and when I saw his name appear on the screen again, I did not pick it up immediately, not out of hesitation but out of intention, because timing mattered now, not to prove anything, but to establish something he would recognize without needing it explained. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice steady. Yes, and there was a brief pause on the other end, shorter than before, sharper, like he had already adjusted his tone from our earlier conversation. We are meeting at 3. He said, no greeting, no explanation, just a directive, and I could hear the structure in it, the attempt to re-establish control through process, through setting the time, the place, the expectation, at the house. He added, and I nodded even though he could not see it, because that was predictable, the environment where he felt most in command. I will be there, I replied, and there was a slight shift in his breathing, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me he had expected resistance, something to negotiate against, and not getting it forced him to adjust again. Good, he said, and then after a fraction of a second, bring any documentation you think is relevant, and there it was, the language of review, of validation, of attempting to pull this back into a framework where he could assess and respond, and I understood exactly why he phrased it that way, because in his mind, relevance was something he determined. Everything that is required has already been submitted, I said calmly, not correcting him, not challenging him, just stating the position clearly. And the silence that followed carried more weight than any argument could have, because it removed the assumption that this was still an open question. We will go through it together, he replied, and there was a subtle shift in his tone again, less directive, more measured, as if he was recalibrating the approach in real time, and I could almost picture the room he was standing in, papers spread out, advisors nearby, everyone trying to interpret something that was not designed to be interpreted, only executed. At 3, I confirmed, and then the call ended just like before, not abruptly, not dramatically, just complete. I lowered the phone slowly, the same calm settling in as it had earlier, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the reality of what was about to happen align with everything that had already been set in motion, because this meeting was not a negotiation, it was not a discussion, it was the moment where their understanding of the system would meet the actual structure behind it. They will come prepared, Harrison said from across the room, and I glanced up at him, already knowing that, because preparation was how my father maintained control, through information, through strategy, through anticipating every angle before stepping into a conversation. So will we? I replied, and there was no hesitation in that, no uncertainty, because this was not about matching their preparation, it was about standing within a framework that had already accounted for it. The drive back to the house felt different than it ever had before, not tense, not emotional, just focused, the familiar streets, the same turns, the same gates, but without the weight they used to carry. because I was not returning as someone trying to fit into their expectations. I was arriving as someone who no longer needed to. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had the night before, unchanged, composed, as if nothing had shifted, but I knew better, because the structure behind it had already begun to move, and that movement was not visible from the outside. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, each step steady, not rushed, not hesitant, and when I reached for the handle, I paused for just a second, not out of doubt but awareness, because this was the threshold between what they believed and what was real, and once I stepped inside, that difference would no longer be abstract. I opened the door and walked in, the familiar interior coming into view, the same arrangement, the same atmosphere. But the energy was different now, quieter, more controlled, like everyone inside was holding on to something they did not fully understand yet. And as I moved toward the living room, I saw them, my father standing near the table, my mother seated with her hands folded, Sophia off to the side. Watching, always watching, and for a brief moment, everything felt exactly the same as it had my entire life, the positions, the expectations, the unspoken roles, and then I realized something that changed everything. Those roles only existed as long as I accepted them, and this time I was not stepping into mine the way I used to. No one spoke immediately when I entered the room, and that silence was not empty, it was calculated, measured, the kind of silence my father used when he wanted to control the pace before anything important was said, and I recognized it instantly, the same way I had recognized every unspoken rule in this house growing up, except this time, I did not respond to it the way I used to. I walked in without rushing, without hesitation, and took a seat at the end of the table, not waiting to be directed, not looking for permission, just choosing a position that made it clear I was not here to be placed, and I could feel their attention shift, subtle but immediate, because that alone was different. My father remained standing for a moment longer before sitting down across from me, his expression composed, controlled, but tighter than usual, like he was holding on to a version of certainty that had already begun to slip, and the documents were spread out in front of him, printed, marked, annotated, evidence of the effort he had put into understanding something that was never meant to be negotiated. "We have reviewed the material," he began, his tone formal, structured, the same tone he used in business meetings when he wanted to establish authority before discussion, and I said nothing because this was not my moment to speak, it was his attempt to frame the situation and I wanted to see how far he would go. "There are inconsistencies," he continued, "areas that require clarification." And there it was, the attempt to create uncertainty where none existed, to reopen something that had already been defined, and I watched him carefully, not reacting, just observing because I could see the pattern clearly now. The same strategy he had used in every situation where control was at risk: redefine, reframe, delay. My mother shifted slightly in her seat. Her hands still folded, her expression softer, almost concerned but not confused, because she had already aligned herself with whatever version of reality my father presented, the way she always had, and Sophia leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, but her eyes fixed on me, studying, calculating, trying to understand where I fit into this new dynamic, not emotionally but strategically. "Emily," my father said, finally addressing me directly, and his voice carried a different tone now. Less declarative, more controlled, as if he was choosing each word carefully. "We need to understand where this originated." And I met his gaze without shifting because that question was not about information, it was about authority, about tracing the source in a way that allowed him to reestablish control. "You already know," I replied, my voice even, not challenging, not defensive, just clear, and the way his expression paused for a fraction of a second told me he understood exactly what I meant, even if he did not want to acknowledge it fully. "Your grandmother's involvement is noted," he said, adjusting his phrasing, moving back into formal language. "But the extent of these provisions is—" He stopped briefly, choosing the next word, "unexpected." And that word carried more truth than anything else he had said so far, because unexpected meant unaccounted for, and unaccounted for meant outside his control. I did not respond immediately, I let that sit, because this was the moment where the difference between what he believed and what was real became impossible to ignore. And I could see it in the room, not in their words, but in the way they held themselves, the slight tension, the careful movements, the awareness that something had shifted in a way they could not fully contain. "The structure is clear," I said finally, my tone steady, "and it is already in effect." And there was no emphasis, no force behind the words, just certainty, and that certainty landed in a way that no argument ever could, because it did not invite debate, it closed it. My father's gaze remained fixed on me, And for the first time, there was no immediate response, no correction, no reframing. Just a pause longer than any he had allowed before, and in that pause, I saw something I had never seen from him, not weakness, not defeat but recognition, the acknowledgement that this situation was not one he could control through language or positioning alone. Sophia shifted slightly in her chair, her expression no longer neutral but more focused now, her attention moving between me and the documents recalculating, and my mother finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "Emily, we can work through this together." And I turned slightly toward her, not dismissive, not cold, just aware, because that was the language she used when she wanted to restore balance without addressing the underlying shift. "There is nothing to work through," I said calmly, and the simplicity of that sentence changed the entire tone of the room, because it removed the premise of negotiation entirely, and for a moment no one spoke again, not because there was nothing to say, but because they were realizing that the structure they had relied on no longer placed them in the position they were used to holding. And I sat there, not pushing, not pressing, just present, because I did not need to do anything else. The system was already speaking for me, and they were finally hearing it. My father was the first to move, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with that same measured control he had relied on his entire life, except now it felt different, not dominant, but deliberate in a way that suggested he was choosing his next position carefully rather than assuming it. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his gaze still fixed on me, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, quieter, less declarative, more calculated. "Then we need to discuss how this is going to be managed going forward." And there it was, not a denial, not a rejection, but a repositioning and acknowledgement wrapped in the only language he trusted, structure. I did not respond immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the importance of that moment, the way a single sentence could redefine the entire direction of a conversation, and I let the silence settle just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the shift that had already taken place. "It will be managed according to the terms that are already in place," I said finally, my tone steady, not confrontational, not defensive, just clear, and the simplicity of that response did something nothing else could have. It removed the assumption that this was still a shared decision, because it was not. My mother's expression changed slightly at that. Not dramatically, but enough to reveal something she had not shown before, uncertainty, not about me, but about the structure she had always relied on, and Sophia leaned forward just a fraction, her focus sharper now, her attention no longer divided, because she understood what my father had already begun to accept. This was not a temporary disruption, it was a redefinition. "Emily," she said, her voice calm but more direct than it had been before. "You are stepping into something complex, something that requires experience." And I met her gaze without shifting, because that argument had been used against me my entire life, the assumption that capability was something granted by others rather than demonstrated through action. "The structure accounts for that," I replied, and again I did not elaborate because I did not need to, the document had already done that for me, and the more I relied on it instead of explanation, the clearer the shift became. My father exhaled slowly, not in frustration but in recognition, and for the first time, he reached for the document in front of him, not to challenge it, but to reference it, his eyes moving across the lines as if confirming something he had already begun to accept. And when he looked back up, the change was subtle but undeniable. He was no longer speaking from assumption, he was speaking from within the structure itself. "There are obligations tied to this," he said, and I nodded once because that was true. This was not just authority, it was responsibility, defined and measurable in a way that left no room for avoidance, and that acknowledgement mattered more than anything else he could have said, because it meant he was no longer questioning the validity of the structure, only the way it would be executed. "And those obligations will be met," I said, my voice steady, and for a moment no one spoke again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been established, and continuing the conversation in the same way would not change the outcome. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not to leave in defiance, but because there was no reason to remain seated in a discussion that had already reached its conclusion, and their eyes followed me, not with the same dismissiveness I had grown used to, but with something else, awareness, the kind that comes when a dynamic has shifted in a way that cannot be undone. "We will proceed with formal communication," I added, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a next step, and my father gave a small nod, a movement so slight it would have been easy to miss if I had not been watching for it. And in that nod was something I had never received from Him before, not approval, not pride, but acknowledgement. I turned toward the door, the same door I had walked through so many times before, always carrying the weight of their expectations, their judgments, their definitions of who I was supposed to be. And this time that weight was gone, not replaced by something heavier, but removed entirely, leaving something clearer, something defined by my own position rather than theirs. As I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation but awareness, because I understood exactly what this moment represented. Not just the end of a conversation, but the end of a system that had defined me for most of my life. And as I stepped out, I realized something that felt almost simple in its clarity. I had not taken anything from them. I had stepped into something that had always been mine, and they were the ones who had to adjust to that reality, not the other way around.